Good morning, afternoon, or evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to your local crackhead behind the Walmart Supercenter. So this is kind of like an addendum to my last video, kind of talking about pro-life libertarianism and things like that. And there are often times when I'm talking with other libertarians about this ideology, or even with liberals, pro-life, pro-choice liberals and things like that. There are very often times you'll reach the point of the argument of, the fact that I'm a Christian. And I will very quickly, without skipping a freaking beat, those guys are going to be like, what about the separation of church and state? And you know what? I get it. All right, I'm a Baptist. They have been historically all about that separation of church and state. Don't get me wrong. But the separation of church and state does not mean the separation of church and state. And I understand you read the title and it said that, and you're like, oh, what does that mean? Here's what I mean. How about you and I hop in my Honda HR-V, and we're going to pretend like it is the car from Back to the Future, and we're going to go back in time to like medieval Bohemia, all right? Now stop and look around. What do you see? Besides the absurd amounts of poverty and plague, what do you see? What you're going to see is a very, very large influence of the Roman Catholic Church. And by influence, I don't mean folks are just religious. Folks is religious, don't get me wrong. But what I mean is that the Roman Catholic Church has a very, very large part to play in the local politics, and in the national politics, and in the transnational politics. The Catholic Church was paramount to a person's position and power back in the medieval times of medieval Europe. And so fast forward to around Luther's era when the Protestant Reformation really gets going. I know there were dissenters against the Catholic Church, over like 1,000 years previously, but focus. So the Reformation gets started in Germany, it kicks off and goes everywhere else. It reaches England, bada bing, bada boom, Anglican Church, and then folks don't like that either, and so they start hopping on boats and go to the New World, right? Well, the Separatists and the Puritans, the main groups that were coming over to the New World to get away from the Roman Catholic Church, had this mindset of the separation of church and state, and that ultimately would come through into the United States of America, into Mexico, Canada, and just a lot of other countries' ideological influence of the separation of the church and the state. So what that meant was just not that your religion didn't influence your politics, as you can see through the past couple hundred years of American history. Religion certainly influenced politics. But what that means is that your state couldn't tell you to go to the local Baptist church down the road by threat of imprisonment, and that your local Presbyterian pastor could not get up on stage and tell you that you had to vote for a certain person lest you be kicked out of the congregation. There was no combining of these things on a national level, just on an ideological level. Because, think about it with me. It doesn't matter what religion you are. What your religious beliefs are very much set up your presuppositions for how you conduct yourself in the world, and that does end up influencing your politics. Like I mentioned before, I am a Christian. I've never been ashamed of this. I'm someone who is a devout Christian. And so for me, the way I view other people is that they are intrinsically valued by God, and so I ought to value them lest I incur the wrath of God for not valuing people like the way he does. And so this extends into things like someone's property, who they are as a person, etc., etc., etc. Do unto others as you want them to do unto you, the golden rule, bada bing, bada boom. There's so many other things you go on with that, but that's ultimately the whole gist of the whole Christian ethics, the presupposition which I base my life on. And you can find a lot of those same principles in many other religions like Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism. A lot of those same presuppositions come from this idea that people have intrinsic value. Now, when you look at an atheistic worldview, you don't really get that. And that's where a lot of the liberals tend to stay, is this idea of there is no greater authority. So maybe this person in me is not really worth living if I don't want it to be so. Now, I understand it doesn't translate perfectly, as there are pro-life liberals, atheists, and things like that, and they're also pro-choice Christians and other things of that sort. Nevertheless, the point still kind of stands, is that very often in the Christian worldview, doesn't matter if you're Protestant, if you're Orthodox, if you're Catholic, the vast majority of Christians would look at pro-choice to be a great sin and a plight on the people of America and across the world. Nevertheless, those with a worldview that say there is no greater authority, there is no higher power, do not view this pro-choice argument to be such a sin, to be such a great evil that's befallen our society. And so ultimately what I want to say about that is that if the liberals can do it for what they want to do, then the Christians should opt to be able to do it as well. And the state should not play hand to either one of those intrinsically. Ultimately, the separation of church and state needs to be on paper, on the practical level, on the way that the government and the churches operate, but personally, politically, and internally, they very much should be intertwined, as the way you view God often, even without trying, affects the way you view politics. So I guess that kind of comes back around to my thinking. There is to be the separation of church and state, but that doesn't mean there has to be the separation of church and state.